Good morning. I'm going to jump in before people get too caught up in other conversations and bring you into what I think will be an intriguing 45 minutes of discussion with Bill Burns. The discussion we want to have today is on prospects for Middle East and the world. Bill Burns was previously the Deputy Secretary of State. As Deputy Secretary of State and in previous incarnations, he was the first person of the United States government who was given the responsibility to begin to make contacts with the Iranian government. And those contacts eventually became a critical factor in moving forward the agreement, the nuclear agreement that was reached with Iran. As Deputy Secretary of State, Bill has covered issues all over the world, but he has also been the Assistant Secretary for the Near East and an ambassador in Jordan. He's been an ambassador in Russia. We've run into each other on the streets in China working on issues, and so has had responsibilities everywhere and has just come back from a trip to India. He's currently the president for the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, and holds a position that gives him an opportunity to give us continuing fascinating insights on the world. We're going to begin with Iran. And last year, Bill was here. We had an opportunity to talk about the prospects for an agreement between the United States and the P5+1 and Iran. At that point, people were guessing, well, maybe likely to get one, but absolutely not guaranteed. Agreements in place. It's now in the process of implementation. Bill, tell us, what did it take to get to what was called Implementation Day? What does that involve?
Sure. Well, first, it's great to see you, Carlos, and very nice to be back here with all of you. The world certainly hasn't gotten any simpler in the years since we last spoke. On Iran, I think implementation of the comprehensive nuclear agreement is off to a solid start, and I have no illusions about the complexities of implementation. I do think, as you suggested, it's important to remember what had to take place before implementation day or the actual easing and lifting of many of the sanctions against Iran. In a sense, the agreement front-loaded Iranian obligations so that Iran was obliged to remove a large stockpile of enriched material, to remove the core of its heavy water reactor at a place called Iraq, which had the potential for producing a plutonium path to a bomb. And so to make a long story short, even before there was any easing of sanctions, you took the potential breakout time within which the Iranians could develop enough enriched material for a single nuclear bomb from what was around 2 months to at least a year now. So I think it's important to understand that Iran had to demonstrate its commitment to the agreement up front. Now the process is going to be a complicated one. It's going to require, I think, really rigorous attention to detail to hold Iran to its obligations, even as we and our international partners fulfill ours. And then the last thing I'd say at the outset is, a challenge for the United States especially is going to be to embed implementation of the nuclear agreement in a very clear-eyed, wider strategy for dealing with an Iran whose behavior continues to threaten our interests and the interests of our friends in some important parts of the Middle East. And that's also going to be, a very important dimension as we, look ahead beyond the nuclear agreement.
So in terms of the benefits that Iran gets out of this, one piece of this were the assets that Iran would be able to get access to. The other was to be able to get access to international markets, in particular international markets for energy. One of the concerns everybody was worried about was, will this suddenly create an emboldened, stronger Iran that is potentially going to be a greater source of instability in the Middle East? What are the initial signs?
Well, I think I never expected, at least speaking for myself, any kind of overnight transformation in Iran's regional behavior. Iran has, for most of the period since its revolution in 1979, been a revolutionary, disruptive power in the Middle East. I didn't expect any overnight transformation in U.S.-Iranian relations. And so I think, we've had to see the agreement on its own merits. In other words, as the best of the available alternatives for ensuring that Iran is prevented from acquiring a nuclear weapon, because amidst all the other chaos in the Middle East today, the last thing any of us need is either an unconstrained Iranian nuclear program or an Iran that acquires a nuclear weapon.
It was striking the pace of implementation, or the pace of action that Iran took in order to get to implementation day. When we talked to many of our former colleagues in the U.S. government, many of them were absolutely sure that it was impossible for Iran to remove 98% of its enriched uranium, to shut down the majority of its centrifuges, to be able to actually, literally take out the core of the plutonium reactor and pour concrete into it and essentially to disable it. And the reasons I mention is that it's actually quite striking that in the agreement itself there are these structural barriers that keep Iran from just tomorrow turning around and being able to produce a nuclear weapon. And I guess one question that many have begun to ask is, how has this positioned President Rouhani in the internal struggles within Iran? Does it give him a greater position to be able to sway the direction that Iran takes in the future? Today, there are obviously parliamentary elections in Iran. What do we think at this point?
Well, I mean, the landscape is littered with people who've made the wrong predictions about Iranian politics. So, at the risk of joining the crowd right now, I'd say the following. First, I think to some extent the elections which are taking place today, both for the Iranian parliament and the so-called Assembly of Experts, which eventually will choose the next supreme leader, are a kind of referendum, not so much, I think, on the nuclear agreement, but on what comes beyond that. In other words, on Rouhani's ambition, at least, to gradually reintegrate Iran into the global economy. And the second point I'd make, though, is that I think on the part of the supreme leader and lots of the hardliners around him at the core of power in this regime, there is a real suspicion of that whole process. And hardliners have really put their thumb on the scale in terms in advance of the elections, with the kind of advanced disqualification of literally half of the people who wanted to run for parliament, most of them moderates. So my uneducated guess would be that what you'll see in the parliamentary elections is a kind of incremental step forward for Rouhani and moderates as opposed to hardliners. But this is going to be a long-running process, and power really is not going to reside in the parliament so much as in the supreme leader's office and the hardliners grouped around him. So this is going to play out for some time, and I think the results are likely to be very uneven.
And one of the ironies and one of the catch-22s of the whole situation is that for President Rouhani to be able to sustain momentum, he needs to show benefits. The more he shows benefits, the more he indicates to the Revolutionary Guards that they are less relevant.
Right.
And yet, if they somehow don't benefit from this process, then they become against it. And so managing that internal political process has to be just phenomenally difficult.
It's going to be extremely difficult, I think, because there's going to be a lot of resistance and suspicion of, the effort that Rouhani has identified himself with, and, a lot of efforts to, in a sense, try to ensure that he doesn't get most of the political credit for the nuclear agreement and what comes beyond that. Second, I think, the lifting of sanctions are only one obstacle that Iran faces, as many of you know very well. You've got enormous problems of red tape, of bureaucracy, of corruption, a lack of investment in energy infrastructure, and lots of other infrastructure sectors in Iran over many years. So it's going to be hard to meet what are pretty high expectations on the part of the Iranian population for economic benefits coming from the nuclear agreement.
In the fall, I was in the Gulf and in the Sunni states, and one of the things that was quite striking was that the principal issue people wanted to talk about was Iran. And you had war in Yemen, you had war in Syria, you had the war of ISIS, but everybody wanted to talk about Iran. And what I consistently heard was this sense of encirclement from Iran. And then, of course, those tensions have been blown up even further after the executions occurred in Saudi Arabia, the break in diplomatic tensions. As someone who was involved throughout your career in relations and trying to build a balance in relations in the Middle East and reassure Sunni allies and friends. How do you respond to a situation like this? What actions does the U.S. government take in order to be able to create a sense of confidence and assurance of our traditional friends and allies?
Well, I mean, I think the first step is to recognize that there's a problem. I mean, there is a great deal of understandable unease in the Sunni Arab world right now, especially in the Gulf, on the part of leaderships who face lots of challenges. A more self-confident Iran, an ambitious Iran, is only one of them. You know, you also have the realities of the global energy market. You have a political transition in Saudi Arabia, which remains complicated. You have the lingering effects of the Arab Spring and a sense of vulnerability on the part of a lot of Sunni Arab states. So it is important, I think, for the United States to do several things. First, as I said before, to push back against Iranian regional threats and demonstrate that we not only recognize those, but second, that we'll do everything we can to reassure our traditional Sunni Arab partners about those kind of external threats. And there are things that we can continue to do in terms of cooperative missile defense and, security relationships that I think are especially important to take over the coming year and into the new administration. And then there's a third factor too, which, where you have to build off that effort to provide reassurance, and that is to work with our traditional Sunni Arab partners to deal with some of the vulnerabilities in the Sunni Arab world on which not only the Iranians prey, but also Sunni extremist groups like ISIS. So to deal with some of the problems that produced the Arab Spring revolutions, whether it's, a lack of economic opportunity, a sense of indignity in a lot of, Sunni Arab states as well. It's easier said than done, but what it means is building a kind of durable two-way street relationship, with a lot of our traditional Arab partners. So we're doing our part to provide reassurance and pushing back against threatening Iranian behavior, but they recognize the stake that they have in dealing with some of those longer-term vulnerabilities.
So one of the ironies in the short term that this has created for energy markets, in particular oil markets, we're used to thinking about political instability adding to a risk premium and adding to the price of oil. And so here we have a situation where, across the world, you think about the events related to ISIS, the Paris bombings, the Egypt bombing or the downing of the Russian aircraft, the tensions that we see between Turkey and Russia and generally in Syria, and even linking some of these issues back here in the United States to San Bernardino, and the price of oil has collapsed. And it reinforces in some ways this phenomenon that what we have seen in front of us is almost a set of diplomatic and political tensions that has resulted in an oil war that has added to the pressure of keeping more oil in the markets that for the short term has actually depressed the price of oil. And the one question that one always asks is, how does this affect, or what's the longevity of this? And let's go back to some of the individual states. For Saudi Arabia, they're phenomenally extended. Not only are they facing the low oil prices that we have today, they are a principal player in the war in Yemen. They have a link and a role and an interest in Syria. They have a direct interest in ISIS. They have a direct interest in what's happening in Iraq. They've had a change in leadership. Saudi Arabia under stress?
No, I think there are a lot of challenges that the Saudi leadership faces today, and it's not any one of them. It's the combination of all the challenges that you just mentioned. And so I think it's going to be important, as I said, from the point of view of American policy, to try to understand, the insecurities and concerns that produces, to provide the kind of reassurance that we can in terms of security and external threats, but then to try to work with not only the Saudis, but the Emiratis and others of our traditional partners to focus on some of those vulnerabilities out there in the region. For example, in Yemen, to turn what is a nasty military conflict right now, into a political process, because, Yemen is a country today that's running out of oil, it's running out of water, and it has very high population growth rates amidst the conflict within the country itself. And so I think it's going to be really important for the Saudis and the Emiratis to kind of move beyond the military intervention at the earliest possible moment and try to create the prospects for, a political process there as well. So I think we have a lot of work to do, the United States does, to rebuild a sense of trust and to provide the kind of reassurance within which I think it becomes possible for the Saudi leadership to make some of those choices.
On some of the regional threats that you've mentioned, Bill, let's go back to Yemen. I mean, trying to reach a political settlement and a political solution would make a lot of sense to everybody. Who can lead it, and what are the prospects to achieve anything that's sustainable there?
Well, it's going to be really tricky. I mean, in recent years, the Gulf Cooperation Council played, I think, a very constructive role in trying to produce a diplomatic process in Yemen with the support of the United States and a number of our European partners. So, I think that's one possibility. And I think the United States needs to continue to do everything that it can to, encourage that right now.
And let's go to Syria for a minute. Prospect of a ceasefire coming, and two issues everybody asks about are, is the ceasefire in effect viable and sustainable? And in particular, related to that, does it lead to some kind of process that one could eventually see leading to stability?
Well, like everybody else, I'm hopeful that the ceasefire cessation of hostilities can get some traction. I have a lot of admiration for the efforts that John Kerry and others have made to produce that cessation of hostilities, but I do understand the pessimism that surrounds all this, because the truth is, I think the only way to sustain a ceasefire is if you can begin a kind of serious political process that points in the direction of a political transition in Syria. And I say that because, I mean a political transition beyond the Bashar al-Assad regime. And I say that for the very practical reason that I don't see how you can marginalize, let alone defeat ISIS in Syria, unless you mobilize the 65-70% of the population of Syria that's Sunni Arab. And I don't see how you do against a Sunni extremist group, ISIS. And I don't see how you accomplish that if Bashar al-Assad is the Syrian face of that effort. So we've got to find ways with our partners in the region and in Europe and elsewhere to reassure Sunni Arabs, to give them a sense that there is a political future in Syria that goes beyond Bashar al-Assad, and that preserves, and this is the especially tricky part, as much of what exists of state structures as you can, so we don't repeat some of the mistakes that we made in Iraq in 2003, or a lot of the huge problems that we see in Libya today as well. So pulling that off is going to be very difficult, and diplomacy, to be effective, has got to be built upon leverage, and I think that's one of the challenges that the administration faces right now. In my experience, neither the Russians nor the Iranians are very sentimental about these issues, and they're not likely to be moved, if ever, in the direction of a serious political process unless we have enough leverage, whether it's through the establishment of safe zones or greater reassurance to Sunni Arabs, that might help focus their attention and provide some basis for a sustained diplomatic effort.
So, to play devil's advocate on the point about the process of transition, some would argue that the ceasefire has actually strengthened Bashar al-Assad because it's coming at a point in time after he has had the benefit of Russian interventions, after attacks that have been explicitly against the opposition to Bashar al-Assad. And so how do you build the confidence to in fact move forward, since he is strengthened, the attacks have been against the Sunni opposition that you needed to get the confidence of?
Well, that's the problem, and that's why I do think there's a case to be made for safe zones, because I think it's going to be I hope very much, as I said before, that the ceasefire can be sustained, but I don't think it can be sustained unless Syrians, especially Sunni Arabs, but also minorities in Syria, see the prospect of a real political transition. And I think it's likely to require, us looking for ways, working with our partners to build greater leverage, to provide that kind of reassurance.
And your point about the safe zone is that you need some form of institutional stability or capacity among those who live in a region to believe in what its future is, to be able to create some assurance for peace. And we've also seen the fragility of that, right? Because in Iraq, after the United States had 150,000 troops and a massive involvement and inject billions of dollars, we've seen the instability that's occurred there. So it reinforces, in a sense, the fragility of this whole process. What does that mean about the necessity of having an international coalition and an international engagement to actually make this all work?
Well, I mean, a coalition, meaning, an effort on the part of countries beyond the United States and beyond our regional partners is really important. But it's also going to require a certain amount of risk, too, because I think just as we learned the huge risks of action in Iraq 2003 and beyond it, there are risks of inaction as well, and I think we see a lot of those playing out in Syria today, too. I don't mean to suggest that it's either the responsibility or within the capacity of the United States to solve all of the problems in the Middle East today. Many of them are fundamental and structural, and they're going to play out for decades. But I don't think we should be so fatalistic about that we neglect some of the things that American leadership can help produce as well. And I think at this moment in the Middle East, without that kind of American leadership, it's really hard to see how that, at a minimum, you're able to prevent a very bad situation from getting a lot worse.
Your point on the importance of solving Syria, or at least achieving some form of stability around a Syria solution in order to be able to advance the battle against ISIS. It makes a lot of sense. It also obviously raises a lot of question marks about what's going to happen in the battle against ISIS, the amount of time that's going to take in order to be able to significantly change that dynamic. What's your sense?
Well, I mean, the sad reality is it is going to take time. It's going to require both a security effort and a political one, as we were discussing before. I mean, people tend to fixate more on the security challenge, which is going to require, air power. It's going to require, I think, ultimately forces on the ground, both in Syria and on the part of the Iraqi, armed forces in Iraq that can, push ISIS back from the territory that it currently controls. But it's also going to require a really, by that I don't mean to suggest American ground forces, but it's going to require, significant local forces, whether it's, over time trained, Syrian moderate opposition forces or others. But it's also going to have to be accompanied by a serious political strategy, too, as I said before, to mobilize that 65-70% of Syria's population that's Sunni Arab, in an effort to defeat a Sunni extremist group, ISIS, and mobilizing the 20% or so of Iraq's population that's Sunni Arab toward the same end in Iraq. And that means that 20% of Iraq's population has to feel, that it has a future in Iraq. And that's going to require, a lot of effort with the current Iraqi government to try to produce, that sense of hope.
Just to the audience, I'm as questions are coming up on cards, I'm building them into the conversation. So I just want you to know, feel free to keep your cards coming. We're keeping a conversation here going. I'm building your questions into them as we try to go. And indeed, one of the questions that has been coming up is the relationship of Russia to the Middle East situation. Going back in September, they became much more actively involved. Many predicted this would be a quagmire for Russia, and now people are saying, wow, they've changed the dynamic in Syria. Can you comment on the importance and the depth of Russia's intervention there, and where does it go?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you take a step back, you look at last August, I think Putin and the Russian leadership were genuinely concerned that the Assad regime was losing altitude in Syria. And so their intervention, which is a fairly modest military intervention, I mean, 36 attack aircraft on its own is not likely to change the battlefield in Syria. But it was well-timed and agile tactically. And what Putin has been able to do is provide a boost to the Assad regime. I think a part of his calculus was to try to change the subject a little bit from the Ukrainian crisis and all the Western sanctions that has produced. I think it was also an opportunity, as he saw it, to reassert Russia's influence in the Middle East and around the world. at a time when, faced with an economy at home that's contracted by 4% over the last year, where he increasingly looks to the assertion of Russian power and influence internationally, as a way of bolstering his control at home. And last but not least, I think for Putin, there's always been a certain satisfaction in sticking his thumb in the American eye, and taking advantage of what fairly or unfairly is seen as a kind of vacuum in the Middle East, and asserting Russia's decisive role in the Middle East. And whether or not this turns out strategically to be a quagmire or counterproductive for Putin and Russia in the short term, he's taken a relatively weak hand and played it pretty skillfully.
Part of the factors affecting the contraction of 4% of GDP in Russia, one element of it has been obviously the collapse in energy prices. Another factor has been the sanctions on Russia because of Ukraine, which has limited their ability to get access to capital markets. And so in a sense, the story brings us back to Ukraine again because it's part of the economic picture. Is there an irony that Russia's engagement in the Middle East and Syria could actually lead them to seek a more reasonable solution in Ukraine to get out of the sanctions, or are the issues disconnected?
I mean, I think the issues are pretty disconnected. You know Ukraine very well, Carlos. I mean, I think from Putin's perspective, and I think it's true of not only Putin, but many across the Russian political elite, what they've sought is a deferential government in Kyiv. And if they can't have a deferential government there, second best is a dysfunctional Ukraine. And so, I think Putin probably got more credit than he deserves a couple years ago when the Ukraine crisis began for being a master chess player and a grand strategist. He was a pretty effective improviser reacting to events. And what he's now set up is a situation in which I think he's betting on three things. First, that Ukraine's going to implode socially and politically and economically. Second, that the European Union is going to get distracted. And third, in my experience at least, Putin has always viewed Americans as having attention deficit disorder. And the sad thing is he may be right about one or all of those things. And so, I think it's really important for the United States and our principal European partners to stay focused on the importance of trying to do everything we can, and a lot of the burden's going to fall on Ukrainians themselves to fight corruption, but to help to rebuild a healthier Ukraine, because I think a Ukraine that has a healthier economy and political system that's anchored in Europe but can serve as a bridge to Russia over the long term is extraordinarily important strategically.
And indeed, in Ukraine itself, I mean, they've gone through their own issues. They've just barely made it through a vote of no confidence in the government. And so that has raised questions that have added to the challenge. But, a year ago, we watched Chancellor Merkel, President Hollande actively engage with Putin, really trying to seek a solution. Are they just too preoccupied these days with one, migrants, and two, just keeping the EU together to really play a role?
I mean, it's a tough moment for the European Union and our principal European partners, as all of you know very well. I mean, you've got challenges almost every place you look on the geographic compass. From the West, there's the whole issue of whether Britain remains a member of the EU. From the South, as you said, the migration crisis and the huge, not only economic and humanitarian challenges it's posed, but also increasingly, the creation of political fissures across European societies. And then from the East, the challenge posed by a resurgent Russia. Russia, by any objective standard, is a declining power, but I think it's always been a mistake in recent years to be dismissive of Russia as a declining power. In my experience, declining powers can be at least as disruptive as rising powers. So our partners in Europe face a huge challenge right now, and I think American leadership, as you look over the rest of the Obama administration and into a new administration, is going to be really important also to provide a sense of reassurance and engagement in the transatlantic community as well.
Yeah, whatever one thinks of the role that President Putin has or hasn't played, I think one of the things one can say with certainty is he will ensure that Russia is not irrelevant.
Yeah, no, in his own unique way. That's true.
So just leapfrogging geographically a little bit, you're just on the way back from India right now, and one of the piece of the discussion that's gone on over the week, it was a central issue that in Davos, it's a critical issue in international markets, is where are the sources of demand going to come from in the future? Where are there points of hope? And everybody asks the question, are we looking at India now? Is there a shift now to India as a place of dynamism that we look to?
Well, I mean, India is a country of huge potential as you look out over the next 5-10 years and beyond. Impressive growth rates of 7.5% today, by contrast to really complicated growth outlooks for so many other countries in the world. I've always been impressed by Prime Minister Modi's sense of determination and vision. But you also, I think, have to be realistic about a lot of the obstacles in the path of India's continued economic modernization. You have literally hundreds of millions of people in India today without regular access to electricity, hundreds of millions of people without toilets, at least 1 million new job seekers coming onto the market every month in India. I think India ranks somewhere like 130th out of 189 countries in the World Bank's ease of doing business scale. So there are lots of challenges ahead. I'm an optimist about, given all the huge infrastructure opportunities and demand in India, given the commitment of the Indian leadership to continue to move ahead to lift literally hundreds of millions of people, more people out of poverty and into the middle class in India. I'm an optimist over the next 5-10 years about what's possible, but I'm a realist about the short term, because there are a lot of obstacles of corruption, of uneven governance, of complicated federal-state relations in India that certainly I think have slowed the Modi government down in trying to deliver on some of the promise and its initial enthusiasm about economic change. So certainly from the point of view of the United States, I think India is a very smart strategic bet. I think it's one of the sort of rarest of things in Washington today. It's an issue that has really strong bipartisan support going back over the last 15 years in the last 3 American administrations. So that's an important investment for the United States to make, and I think there will be increasing economic opportunities. Vice President Biden talked about, a target of $500 billion in two-way trade over the next few years. It's going to take at least a few years to get to that point, but I think there are a lot of possibilities there.
Well, on that issue of the U.S.-India strategic partnership, it started with massively visible action on the civil nuclear program, historic and change. And one of the questions is what comes next, and part of that is international. Does the U.S.-India relationship become a foundation for greater international coordination? And part of it is domestic, as you said, in terms of doing business. And what's your sense of the prospect for it picking up on the potential that it might have?
Well, I mean, I think the conclusion of the civil nuclear agreement, in which I played a small part in 2008, was a very dramatic step forward in U.S.-India relations. And you don't have those kind of dramatic breakthroughs, every year in managing any kind of a relationship. And now the challenge, I think, is the kind of day in, day out business of trying to deepen a partnership, which requires a lot of focus across both governments and both societies. I think the truth is, in defense cooperation, there's been a lot of progress in recent years. I think India today does more military exercises with the United States than any other country. There's been a lot of growth in military-to-military cooperation as well. I think there are a lot of possibilities in other sectors. I think India is playing an increasingly important role across the Asia-Pacific. And as we look at, the significance of U.S.-China relations, it's also important to see U.S.-India relations and India's role in Asia as an important dimension of that as well. So I think, as I said before, it's a very smart strategic bet for the United States. It's going to have to be sustained as you look to the next administration and beyond that. But I think, what's different now about U.S.-India relations is that really for the first time in history, we each have a stake in each other's success, which hasn't always been the case in years past. And when you're talking about, the world's 2 biggest democracies, 2 of the world's largest economies, that's not an insignificant opportunity.
And your point that we each have a stake in the other's success is quite significant. It's worth very much keeping in mind. China. The G20 finance ministers are there today. Hank Paulson, who was here last year, kicked off the public discussions encouraging China to act on its reform agenda. Chinese head of central bank responded with saying that we will take measured steps, and that dynamic is not quite exactly what the international community had hoped for. See issues with the South China Sea, a battle against corruption, which on the one hand is morally tremendous, and others have argued have been part of the issue of what has been slowing down economic growth. All of these issues around the internal Chinese dynamic. But interestingly, in the meantime, has the U.S.-China relationship become more constructive?
It's a complicated relationship. I mean, if you take a step back, there's no phenomenon on the international landscape today that's more important than the rise of China, and no bilateral relationship for the United States more important than our relationship with China. The truth is, Chinese foreign policy has been more pugnacious in some areas in recent years, and that comes at a time when China and Xi Jinping's leadership faces, a lot of domestic challenges. It's not an easy thing, as the Chinese leadership is finding, to make a transition to a different model of economic growth based more on services and consumption. Problems of pollution, of corruption, are still, significant challenges in China today. So inevitably, I think the U.S.-China relationship is going to be a mix of competition and cooperation. History's full of collisions between rising powers and established powers, and if we're honest with ourselves, that's possible in U.S.-China relations, but I do not believe it's inevitable or foreordained. And I think what's really crucial is to build that stable mix, which means you got to find areas of common ground, which the United States has had some success in doing with China in recent years on the environment, on non-proliferation issues. It looks like we're making good progress toward a new Security Council resolution in New York, which would impose tougher sanctions on North Korea, which is an important sign of U.S.-Chinese cooperation. But we also have to be honest about the challenge of managing differences more maturely. You mentioned the South China Sea, at which a lot is at stake when you consider the significant proportion of global commerce that moves through the South China Sea, and a lot of very troubling Chinese behavior in creating these artificial land features and then moving, notwithstanding what President Xi said when he visited Washington in September, toward the militarization of some of those land features. And so it's going to be a big challenge to work with our partners in Southeast Asia and ASEAN to push back against that kind of behavior. And cybersecurity has also been a long-running irritant in U.S.-China relations. So there could be no shortage of areas of competition to manage, but I am reasonably optimistic that we can continue to find areas of common ground as well.
The big challenge underlying all of this is how to use those positive areas in the relationship to be able to build a sense of confidence and trust that you can deal with hard issues and somehow reach a resolution. And perhaps maybe the hardest one could end up being the South China Sea. It's extraordinarily complicated politically and economically.
It is, and I think what's at issue, again, is not just, the significance for the global economy of the South China Sea as a transit route, but also how problems get resolved. Because, the United States, as a matter of policy, hasn't taken a position on the kind of individual maritime disputes that pit China against some of our Southeast Asian partners. But what we do take a position on is how they get resolved. They need to be resolved peacefully, consistent with international law. The United States has put itself at a little bit of a disadvantage since for many, many years now we've failed to ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty or Convention. And, that would provide an even, more solid basis in international law for dealing with some of these kind of disputes.
Yesterday in a panel on climate change, I was chairing Robert Orr, who was Assistant Secretary General and responsible for coordinating the geopolitical contacts and relationships in the Paris agreements. I asked Bob, what were some of the things that actually kept it together when it became difficult? And he said, the most fundamental thing was that when countries started to fall out of line, the United States and China went together and said, we have to get this done. Which
No,
is quite
it's
stunning.
true, and I think that in many ways is the most reassuring example, as you look over the past year of what's possible when the United States and China find common ground. And when you find common ground, it's rooted in self-interest. China has a huge environmental problem to deal with, but I think U.S.-Chinese leadership has been really crucial, not only in producing the agreement in Paris, but in building on that to help reduce carbon emissions in the years ahead. And it had a big impact on, I think, India's eventual decision to be supportive of that effort in Paris.
We've talked about a huge range of challenges and have not even covered every single piece of the world. But then, let's think about 9 months from now, 10 months from now, a new U.S. president comes into office. How do you set priorities in addressing this global set of challenges?
Yeah, well, I think, all the people running for president now probably need to be a little careful what they wish for, because it's a complicated world out there, as all of you know very well. I guess I'd say several things in response as you kind of think about framing, how the United States approaches a really complicated international landscape, and one on which power is a lot more diffuse than it was, when I entered the Foreign Service 34 years ago at the height of the Cold War. First, I think it's important for a new administration, any American leadership, to approach those problems with a sense of perspective. I don't mean this as a statement of American arrogance at all, but I'd much rather play the American hand than the hand of, any of our peer competitors over the course of the next few years. The truth is, by any, measure of international power, the United States has a lot of advantages. We spend more every year on our military than the next 9 countries put together. Our economy is still the biggest, most innovative, most resilient in the world. Energy, as all of you know very well, is a huge, an increasing source of strength, I think, not only in hydrocarbons, but in clean and renewable energies. Demography is an asset in, since we have a younger and more mobile population than our peer competitors, especially if we can ever get immigration reform right. Geography are 2 liquid assets, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, that insulate us to some extent from the challenges that, lots of other major powers are more vulnerable to. And soft power, and here I don't mean the, power of the Kardashian family, but the attractiveness of the United States at our best when we demonstrate our resilience and our mobility and our sense of possibility. So all of that creates, I think, a window for the United States as you look out over the next 20, 30 years, in which we really are likely to be the first among unequals in the world. And we have an opportunity to shape, events and relationships and global institutions before they get shaped for us inevitably over time by the rise of other powers and, other events. And I think the 3 things that are going to be most important when you think about how you frame priorities in a new administration in foreign policy are going to be, first, to reinforce the domestic foundations of American power, which is going to be absolutely crucial, which means not only our economy, our energy advantages, but education, dealing with problems of income inequality in this country, creating an even greater sense of possibility and national purpose. Second, to rebalance, both our investments and our efforts, and to reassert American leadership, especially in those 3 parts of the world that we talked about, where order is really being challenged: in the Asia-Pacific region with the rise of China, in Europe with, the resurgence and the disruptive potential of even a declining Russia alongside all the other challenges that Europe faces, and then in the Middle East. And then finally, I think, to pay attention to the challenge of reshaping global institutions which fit the world of 1945 but may not fit so neatly in 2016, so that we're dealing with challenges of global commerce. I'm a believer in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the new trade agreement with, it's been negotiated with a number of our partners across the Asia-Pacific, ultimately in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the kind of European analog to that. Put together, it would knit together about 2/3 of the global economy along, a fairly high-end set of international standards. And to be able to do that before, whether it's China or any other country, is able to shape those rules for us. And I think we face similar kinds of challenges in dealing with cyber issues, kind of, like the situation that the United States faced 60 years ago in dealing with the phenomenon of nuclear energy. We have to take the lead in developing rules of the road around the world for dealing with cyber issues. And then last but not least, climate issues as well, as we discussed before, which, I think in which the United States, working with China and other big powers, needs to continue to make progress.
Bill, you continue to reflect what is the best in American foreign policy, the ability to have a vision, honesty about what your challenges are, clarity about what your objectives, and understanding how to play your own hand and play it with your allies. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Burns.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.